If you were taught that the Civil War ended in 1865, you were taught something true but deeply incomplete. The cannons went silent. The armies went home. Slavery was abolished. But a quieter war had only just begun, one that never officially ended. A war over money, power, and who controls the future of the American economy. Its weapons were not rifles or artillery, but laws, contracts, debt, and institutions. And the strange part is this. Many of the economic rules you live under today were forged not during the industrial boom of the 20th century, but in the emergency decisions of the Civil War itself. Here's the mystery. How did a conflict fought over union and slavery permanently reshape federal power, corporate influence, military spending, and national debt in ways that still determine who wins and who loses in modern America? And why do so many of today's economic debates sound eerily similar to arguments first made more than 150 years ago? To understand this, we have to stop thinking of the Civil War as just a military event. It was also the largest economic shock in U.S. history up to that point. It forced the federal government to do things it had never done before, on a scale that had never been imagined. And once those doors were opened, they could never be fully closed again. Before the war, the United States was a very different country financially. The federal government was small by design. For most Americans, Washington felt distant and limited. There was no income tax. There was no permanent national banking system. The army was tiny. Most public spending happened at the state or local level. The prevailing belief, especially in the South but shared widely elsewhere, was that concentrated federal power was dangerous. Liberty, people believed, lived in decentralization. The economy reflected that philosophy. The country was overwhelmingly agrarian. Wealth was tied to land, crops, and, in the South, enslaved labor. Industrialization was growing in the North, but it had not yet reshaped national policy. Banks were mostly local or state-chartered. Currency varied wildly depending on where you were. $1 in New York might not be worth the same in Illinois. This chaos was tolerated because it aligned with a deeper belief. The federal government should not be the central manager of economic life. Then the war came, and that belief collided with reality. When southern states seceded, they didn't just leave politically, they took with them a massive share of the nation's wealth-producing system. Cotton exports collapsed. Trade routes were disrupted. Tax revenue vanished overnight. At the same time, the Union suddenly faced expenses on a scale no American government had ever confronted. Armies had to be raised, clothed, fed, armed, transported, and paid. Railroads had to be coordinated. Weapons had to be manufactured in unprecedented quantities. The Union was staring at a problem with no historical playbook. How do you finance a modern war when your government was designed to avoid central financial power? The first answer was borrowing. Lots of it. The federal government began issuing massive amounts of war bonds, appealing directly to citizens to fund the fight. This alone was a shift. For the first time, ordinary Americans were being asked to think of themselves as creditors to the national government. Patriotism and finance became intertwined. Supporting the Union wasn't just about enlistment, it was about investment. But borrowing wasn't enough. In 1861, federal revenues covered only a fraction of war expenses. Tariffs, the main source of income, could not scale fast enough. So Congress did something radical. In 1862, it passed the first federal income tax. This was supposed to be temporary, an emergency measure justified by existential threat. But it shattered a long-standing taboo. For the first time, the federal government claimed the right to tax citizens directly based on income, not just trade or land. This was not just a new tax. It was a new relationship between citizen and state. At the same time, the government took another unprecedented step. It began issuing paper money not backed by gold or silver. These greenbacks were declared legal tender by law. Before the war, such a move would have been unthinkable to many Americans, who feared inflation and centralized control. But war compresses ideology. Survival becomes the argument that overrides all others. The results were immediate and destabilizing. Inflation surged. prices rose faster than wages. Creditors and debtors found themselves on opposite sides of a new economic battlefield. Sound familiar? It should. The argument over hard money versus flexible currency, over inflation versus growth, would echo for generations. But perhaps the most consequential change happened quietly, in the structure of American capitalism itself. To fight the war, the Union government turned to private industry on a massive scale. Contracts were issued for rifles, uniforms, boots, rail transport, iron, food supplies, and more. This was not a free market free-for-all. It was centrally coordinated, federally funded demand. Companies that could scale quickly, deliver reliably, and navigate Washington politics flourished. Many became industrial giants almost overnight. This was the birth of the modern military-industrial relationship in America. Before the Civil War, the U.S. military largely relied on small arsenals and limited suppliers. After it, entire industries were shaped by government demand. Railroads received land grants and contracts that tied their fortunes directly to federal policy. Ironworks and armories expanded beyond anything the peacetime market could have justified. War did not just consume resources, it reorganized economic power. And crucially, these companies did not disappear when the war ended. As the conflict dragged on, the federal government also centralized authority in ways that would have sparked outrage just a decade earlier. It regulated railroads, it standardized production, it intervened directly in markets to ensure supply. Each action was framed as temporary, each one set a precedent. This is where the deeper shift occurred. The Civil War taught the federal government that it could mobilize the economy, direct industry, manage currency, and reshape markets, if it had a compelling enough reason. And it taught private industry that aligning with federal priorities could be enormously profitable. But this transformation came at a cost. By 1865, the national debt had exploded from about $65 million to over $2.7 billion. Adjusted for today, that's trillions of dollars, added in just 4 years. The United States had gone from a lightly indebted republic to one of the world's most heavily indebted nations. Debt changes politics. Creditors demand stability. Investors demand predictability. Governments become more sensitive to financial markets. This dynamic began during the Civil War and never fully reversed. Meanwhile, the Confederacy experienced its own economic catastrophe. Lacking industrial capacity and international recognition, it relied heavily on printing money. Inflation spiraled out of control. By the end of the war, Confederate currency was nearly worthless. Savings evaporated. Trust in institutions collapsed. This contrast would matter deeply in the years ahead. When the war finally ended, the country faced a breaking point. The guns were silent, but the economy was unrecognizable. The federal government was larger, more powerful, and more deeply embedded in daily economic life than ever before. Corporations tied to wartime production now sought peacetime influence. Millions of formerly enslaved people entered a labor market structured to exclude them. Southern infrastructure was destroyed. Northern capital dominated national policy. The question was no longer how to win the war, it was what kind of country would emerge from it. Many Americans assumed the emergency measures would be rolled back, that the income tax would fade away, that federal power would shrink, that the economy would return to its old balance between local control and national restraint. That assumption would prove dangerously wrong, because the systems built during the war had momentum, and momentum, once gained, is hard to stop. The immediate post-war years revealed a deeper truth. The Civil War had not just preserved the Union, it had quietly rewritten the rules of American political economy, and the consequences of that rewrite were only beginning to unfold. When the war ended, Americans wanted closure. They wanted to believe the country could simply return to normal. But there was no normal to return to. The economic machinery built to win the Civil War did not shut down when Appomattox was signed. It shifted targets. The federal government was now the largest economic actor in the nation. It collected new kinds of taxes, managed a national currency, carried massive debt, and had deep relationships with powerful corporations. And in the vacuum left by the defeated Southern elite, Northern capital stepped into a dominant position it had never held before. This is where the aftershocks truly began. Reconstruction is often discussed as a political and social struggle, but it was also an economic experiment under extreme conditions. The South lay in ruins, railroads destroyed, cities burned, farms abandoned. The labor system that had generated much of the region's wealth was gone. At the same time, the federal government had neither the appetite nor the political unity to fundamentally restructure Southern wealth ownership. Formerly enslaved people were free, but they were free into an economy designed to keep them dependent. Land reform, which could have redistributed economic power, was abandoned. Instead, systems like sharecropping emerged. On paper, sharecropping looked like a compromise. Landowners provided land and supplies, laborers provided work, and profits were shared. In reality, it was a debt trap. Credit flowed from landowners and merchants to laborers at punishing terms. Crop liens locked farmers into cycles of borrowing they could not escape. This was not an accident. It was a direct result of post-war financial structures that prioritized creditor stability over debtor freedom. The same logic that had justified protecting union bondholders now shaped Southern labor relations. Debt, once again, dictated power. Meanwhile, in the North, wartime industries converted to peacetime dominance. Railroads expanded aggressively, fueled by federal land grants and favorable regulation. Banks consolidated, industrial trusts formed. The relationship between government and big business, normalized during the war, became a permanent feature of American life. This period gave rise to what later generations would call the Gilded Age. Explosive growth, enormous fortunes, stark inequality. And here's the key point. None of this was a historical accident. The Civil War had accelerated trends that were already present, but it also removed the barriers that once limited federal and corporate power. The emergency had become the blueprint. One of the clearest examples was the national banking system. Created during the war to stabilize finance and help sell government bonds, it standardized currency and centralized control over credit. This brought real benefits, reduced chaos, easier interstate commerce, and a more reliable financial system. But it also concentrated power in fewer hands and tied banking stability directly to federal policy. Every financial panic that followed, from the 1870s onward, was shaped by this new reality. When crises hit, the question was no longer whether the federal government should intervene, but how. Farmers and workers began to notice the pattern. Prices for crops fell, wages stagnated, debt remained fixed, creditors prospered. This sparked political movements that explicitly traced their grievances back to wartime economic decisions. The Greenback movement, for example, demanded expanded currency to ease debt burdens, arguing that the gold-backed system favored banks and bondholders. Sound familiar? These debates weren't abstract. They were arguments about who the Civil War economy was really built to serve. By the late 19th century, the United States had become a global industrial power. But it was also deeply divided economically. The federal government, once feared as too strong, was now often criticized for being captured by corporate interests. Railroads set prices that crushed small farmers, trusts dominated markets. Labor unrest exploded into strikes that sometimes turned violent. And every time the federal government stood at the center, choosing when to intervene, when to suppress, and when to protect property over people. The Civil War had taught Washington that it could use force, finance, and law to shape economic outcomes. It had not taught it how to do so equitably. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the pattern repeats under new names. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. Each crisis justified massive expansions of federal economic power. Each time, those powers were only partially rolled back. Income tax rates fluctuated, but the tax itself became permanent. Military contracts grew into a standing defense industry. Federal debt rose, stabilized, then rose again. By the Cold War, the United States had institutionalized what the Civil War improvised: a permanent, war-ready economy. President Eisenhower famously warned about the military-industrial complex, but by then it was already a century old in practice. The logic was identical to 1862. National security required industrial coordination. Industrial coordination required government spending. Government spending created powerful private beneficiaries. The aftershocks continued into the present. Today, the federal government spends hundreds of billions annually on defense contracts. Entire regions depend economically on military bases and suppliers. During crises, from financial collapses to pandemics, Washington injects trillions into markets, stabilizing institutions deemed too big to fail. Once again, emergency justifies expansion, and once again, rollback proves elusive. Consider national debt. In 1860, it was negligible. After the Civil War, it became a permanent feature of governance. Today, it exceeds the size of the entire economy. The debate is no longer whether debt is acceptable, but how much is tolerable and who ultimately bears the cost. Consider currency. The greenbacks of the Civil War broke the psychological link between money and metal. Today's fiat currency system is a direct descendant of that decision. Inflation fears, monetary expansion, central bank power, all trace their lineage back to the moment survival outweighed orthodoxy. Consider federal authority. The idea that Washington can mobilize industry, regulate markets, and reshape economic behavior is no longer controversial. It is expected. That expectation was born in wartime necessity. And consider inequality. The Civil War ended slavery, but it did not end economic stratification. In many ways, it replaced one system of concentrated power with another. Wealth accumulated rapidly at the top during wartime and post-war booms. Those without capital entered systems defined by debt and dependency. That pattern has repeated across centuries. Here's the unsettling realization. The Civil War did not just decide who governed the United States. It decided how governance itself would function economically. It established that in moments of crisis, federal power would expand, private interests would align with that power, and the resulting structures would endure long after the crisis passed. The temporary becomes permanent, the emergency becomes normal. So what does this mean for us now? First takeaway: economic systems are often shaped less by careful planning than by crisis improvisation. The most influential financial decisions in American history were made under extreme pressure, with survival as the justification. Once embedded, those decisions outlive the conditions that created them. Second takeaway: debt is not just a financial tool, it is a political force. From Reconstruction sharecropping to modern student loans and national deficits, debt structures relationships of power. Who owes whom matters more than almost any ideology. Third takeaway: federal power and corporate power have grown together, not in opposition. The Civil War revealed that they can reinforce each other, especially during emergencies. That partnership can produce incredible capacity, but also deep inequality and dependency. And here's the warning. If history is any guide, the next major crisis will once again expand federal economic authority in ways that feel necessary and unavoidable. The real question is not whether that will happen, but whether we understand the long-term consequences while it's happening. Because the most important economic decisions are rarely announced as permanent. They're framed as temporary fixes, emergency measures, one-time responses. That's how the Civil War still shapes your life today. Not because it's over, but because economically, in many ways, it never really ended. If you want to understand the present, you have to study the emergencies that built it. And if you want to influence the future, you have to recognize which temporary decisions are quietly becoming permanent right now. Share it. Subscribe for deeper dives into the forces that shape power beneath the surface. And the next time a crisis demands rapid economic action, remember, the aftershocks may last far longer than anyone expects.